the man most closely associated with the notion of social contract theory in the United States is an Englishman by the name of John Locke. And so it's his views on consent to government that we'll be exploring in this lecture. Now, social contract theory didn't start with John Locke, and many famous early modern political theorists endorsed some kind of social contract theory. We've already looked at Hobbes in this class. We're looking at Locke. We're not going to get a chance to look at Rousseau and Kant, and earlier Hugo Grotius and Samuel Pufendorf in Germany also had variations of a social contract theory. But all of these theorists are addressing fundamentally the same problem. How do people who are born naturally free come to have political obligations to a state? Now, it's important to understand this idea of natural freedom. Prior to the 16th century, and even throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, and even the beginning of the 19th century, many people thought that we were not born naturally free. That is to say, we were born with obligations already upon us, political and social obligations. We were born as part of a great chain of being, atop which stood kings and monarchs, and at the bottom were the least worthy animals, I suppose, and sort of in the middle were most people. And as a result, we were born with an obligation to obey our natural betters. But starting with the Renaissance in Italy, and then spreading to Flanders, and then through Protestantism to England, the idea that people were not born enslaved to others, but actually born free of obligation until they chose to assume obligations, became popular. And so the problem is how do these free persons then come to have political obligations? The solution was to consent to a set of institutions that will help better secure their common interests, and their common interests were often conceived of as being wrapped up in their life, their liberty, and their property. So social contract theory implies that we are relying on the idea of a contract. But what's a contract? Well, a contract is an enforceable agreement, and it generally specifies the terms of an exchange, as well as the penalties for violating the terms of the exchange, and rewards for doing more than necessary in some cases. Now, some key features of contracts. One thing is that contracts will successfully bind people to the extent that people's rights are alienable. So if it would be wrong for me to surrender certain rights, like if it would be wrong to me to surrender my right to enforce and judge crimes, then I can't surrender it to the state, and so any contract that I sign to that effect would be null and void. So some example would be, for example, I can't consent to surrender your rights because they're your rights. So anything that you consent on, you can't really consent on behalf of other people. And of course, even with respect to yourself, there's disagreement about whether, for instance, your right to life and certain sort of central interests, like your right to marry, for instance, would be the kind of right that you could alienate to the state, to have the state decide who you should marry, and the state decide whether you should live or die. Again, these might be the sorts of rights that are inalienable, and even more than inalienable, imprescriptible, right? Inalienable cannot be given away, imprescriptible cannot be taken away. These are the sorts of rights that, so there might be some rights that you can't contract out, so to speak. But many rights, it seems that we probably can, and so there's going to be some disagreements about the limits of government. Part of the disagreements over how big and powerful government should be is a disagreement about the extent to which we can alienate some of our rights and duties, right? There might be duties that we have to perform ourselves, things like, say, raising your children. Is it permissible for us to alienate our duty to raise our children? Well, most of us do. Most of us entrust a lot of the raising of our children to outside agencies, schools, nannies, daycares, babysitters, and so on and so forth. But maybe that's not something we should be allowed to do. Okay, so assuming you can alienate a right, then presumably you can contract it out. Now, generally speaking, the state is only authorized to further certain common interests of citizens. That is to say, the purpose of the contract is to further our common interests, not to further the private interests of some of the public over other private interests of other parts of the public. So, that being said, because the common interest is itself subject to frequent disagreement, that is to say, what it would be in our common interest to do is not something we always agree about, the state in practice is going to have a wide-ranging authority, even over areas where citizens disagree that the state should be doing these things. Now, in effect, what citizens have consented to is a dispute settlement mechanism, not to any specific outcome. So you haven't consented to a state that's going to protect, say, life, liberty, and property. What you've really consented to is probably something like a procedure for settling questions about what the state should do, including how it should protect certain vital interests of yours. Now, like any bargain, the dispute settling mechanism set up is not going to be optimal from the reference point of any single individual. That is to say, you're going to have to probably give up some things that you want in order to get other things that you want more, right? So whatever it is, so you're going to have to give up some freedom in order to get some peace, justice, and stability of expectations. The social contract is only ever going to be optimal in some sense from a collective point of view, not necessarily from the individual. Some of us value our freedom more, and we would like to surrender less of it. Other people value their freedom almost not at all, and they would like to give all of it away. So we're not all going to get what we want out of the state, but to the extent that we give away some things that we want more for things that we want less, things that we want less for things that we want more, then we're getting a better deal out of the state than we could get without it. Now, there's some immediate problems with social contract theory, which is that none of us in practice ever sign a contract, with perhaps some rare exceptions, people who go to serve in the military or serve in public office, or perhaps people who become naturalized as American citizens. All of them perhaps sign contracts, but the vast majority of American citizens never sign a contract. So social contract theory in that sense is non-existent on its face. No one's actually consented. Now, does this mean our modern governments can't be justified by reference to a kind of contract that all, say, qualified citizens agree to? Well, maybe, maybe not. Just because you didn't agree explicitly doesn't mean that you can't agree in less explicit manners. One form of nonverbal agreement is called tacit consent, literally silent consent. So if I say to my on-ground class, there will be class next Tuesday at 8 p.m. rather than our usual time, are there any objections? And assuming that nobody speaks up, then everyone in the class has tacitly consented to changing the meeting to Tuesday 8 p.m. Silence here is equivalent to action. Not saying something binds you. Now, this is tricky because silence can mean a lot of things. Maybe some students were staring out the window and not paying attention, and other students thought, I don't know, they could have been asleep. And if that's the case, then their silence just does not seem to be consent. Their silence just means they're not paying attention or they're asleep. So we don't want to assume that silence always means yes, but it does seem to be the case that under certain circumstances where everybody's awake and paying attention and understands the question and so on and so forth, under those circumstances, your silence counts as consent. I gave you an opportunity to object, you didn't object. It seems like your silence binds you. So we can ask ourselves, what are the kinds of circumstances that would make silence a sign of consent? And are those circumstances applicable to the modern state? That is to say, when citizens don't explicitly consent to the state, perhaps they nonetheless tacitly consent to the state if the situation meets the kinds of criteria where usually silence means consent. So individuals have to be aware that this is a consent kind of situation. Otherwise, silence would not mean assent, and I talked about the awareness condition when I talked about students who might be asleep or not paying attention. There also has to be some understood period of time when expressions of non-consent can be registered, right? So it has to be clear how much time you have. Because, of course, if I say, if I say all those who oppose object now, that sort of gives you a time frame. But if somebody starts objecting 2 hours later, it just doesn't seem like their objection now suddenly counts when no one else is around and the class was dismissed. Okay, there also has to be some point at which non-consent, or the point at which non-consent no longer counts must be clear. So that's what I was talking about when I was talking about the person who doesn't consent 2 hours later, right? But if it's not clear how long you have, then of course your silence right now just could mean, hey, I'm thinking about it, right? Not I'm consenting, but I'm thinking about whether to consent or not. And so, again, this question of duration is important. The fourth condition is that the means acceptable for signaling non-consent have to be reasonable and easily performed, right? So if I say show non-consent by performing a backflip or show non-consent by cutting your right arm off, the fact that you're not doing a backflip or not cutting your arm off does not mean you consent. It just means that the means for signaling dissent are way out of line. And so, again, you have to be able to say no without cutting your arm off. Otherwise, your silence just means I don't want to cut my arm off. It doesn't mean I want to have class Tuesday at 8 p.m. And finally, the consequences of non-consent can't be so extremely bad to you, to the person who refuses consent. So if silence just means inability to refuse, not necessarily by not being able to perform the means of non-consent, but let's say that let's say that the person asking for your consent is blackmailing you or something. Your silence doesn't mean you consent, it just means you don't want something really embarrassing revealed about you, in which case, again, silence does not mean consent. So, generally speaking, all of these conditions, I know they're kind of technical, but what it all means in the end is silence has to be very clearly, beyond a reasonable doubt, mean consent. If we can interpret silence to mean other things, like coercion, or inability to say no, or inattention, or being asleep, or something else, if we can interpret silence to not mean, or I'm thinking about it, if we can interpret silence to mean something else than consent, then we can't take your silence to mean consent. By the way, and I often do this when I do this lecture in class, you can analogize other areas where consent is really important. Most people think of intimate areas, both sexual relations and marriage. And when we, first of all, you can never get married through tacit consent, right? And a lot of people are moving towards the idea that intimate relations have to be subject to explicit consent as well. Silence can no longer mean yes, so to speak. And I think the reason for that is in areas where consent really, really matters, we want explicit consent. It's just so much more clear, whereas when we think about tacit consent, we have to infer from silence, and that's less clear. There's more wiggle room to think of ways in which silence doesn't mean consent. So if you think the consent to the state is really, really important, you might not want tacit consent. It might not be good enough. But let's think about it. Is tacit consent the answer? Well, we've got to think about how much our situation is analogous to the situation of the people in a meeting who are trying to reschedule. First of all, are people generally aware that they have the option not to consent? That's a tricky question. Most people don't think about issues of political theory very much. They don't really think about this at all, and particularly if they don't go to college, and particularly if they don't take a class in philosophy or political theory. So most people probably aren't even thinking about whether they're consenting or not. They treat government, taxes, laws as a given, not as something that is subject to critical review, but something they have to deal with. And if that's the case, then it's not clear that they have the option not to consent, or that they're aware of the option not to consent. Second, are the means of signaling non-consent easy to perform? Well, how would you signal your non-consent? Would you not vote in an election? Would that count as non-consent? Would you have to leave the country? Would you have to turn in your passport? How easy is it to do those things? Okay, think about it. Third, are the consequences of non-consent extremely detrimental? Then I say, what happens if you don't consent? Well, in some cases, nothing happens. It doesn't. I don't think the government really cares whether you consent or not. So in that sense, nothing happens if you don't consent. On the other hand, you might say, okay, if I have a means of performing non-consent, that is to say, if I leave the country and I surrender my passport, what are the consequences for me of doing that? Is it really bad or really good? And I think that probably varies. I mean, some people, like myself, who have multiple passports, it's not too hard to leave. But for others who don't have a lot of money and have a hard time moving around and aren't aware of options and don't have the kinds of skills that other countries want and are looking for, and therefore are unlikely to get work visas, for those people, the consequences of non-consent are pretty bad. Finally, one thing to think about is that even the option leaving already means that, or already seems that to assume what needs to be proven. That is to say that the government has authority. So think about it this way. It seems that by forcing you to either consent or leave your friends, your family, your job, and everything you know, it seems like the government, by being able to make you make that choice, is already assuming that it has authority to make you make that choice. And yet it's its authority to make you make that choice that needs to be justified. And so, in some sense, putting you to the question of consent already assumes that, or presumes that it has the right to do so. And that, why can't you tell the government to rule, accept my terms or leave, or stop being the government? It sounds absurd, right? But it seems that, if there was no more reason to think that the government had authority than it didn't, because it needed to be justified, then that doesn't seem like the craziest of notions. Okay. So, it doesn't look like tacit consent meets our conditions when it comes to the government. It just does not look like most American citizens are aware that there's a consent situation going on. It doesn't look like the means, it looks like the means of not consenting are pretty heavy, are pretty difficult to meet, and it sounds like the consequences of not consenting are pretty heavy as well. And so it just doesn't look like tacit consent is a very promising way of justifying political authority. It looks like silence could just mean not being very bright. It could mean not having a lot of political information. It could mean not having a lot of options, or a lot of money, or a lot of skills, or a lot of knowledge. And so if silence means all those things instead of consent, then it just doesn't look like tacit consent is going to do the job we want to do. So maybe it's not tacit consent, but there are other ways to signify consent. It's not quite tacit, but it's not quite explicit. And sort of this in-between method is called implied consent. And it's kind of what Socrates is referring to in the Crito, where it's not so much that your silence is inferring consent, it's that your behavior is inferring consent, or is implying consent. One could infer your consent from your behavior, not from your silence, and not from anything you say that would be explicit, but from how you act. And I think most people think that ultimately continued residence in a country is a kind of implied consent, and we're going to turn to this in our next lecture.